Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Marion Ficshman Lecture. I wanted to introduce Michelle Lawful to welcome up Sharon Walsh as our awardee.
It's my pleasure to get to introduce Dr. Sharon Walsh for the Ficshman Award. And the goal of the Ficshman Award is to recognize the contributions of an outstanding woman scientist in drug abuse research. And this is not surprising to me that Sharon would win this, because not only is she an amazing scientist, but she is so much more. I've learned some about Sharon that I didn't know about her based on some other wonderful scientists that also nominated Sharon along with me, Dr. Balster, and Dr. Finnegan has written award letters in the past, and so I learned some from her too, and Dr. Bigelow. So from Dr. Balster, I learned that actually Marion Ficshman and Sharon have quite a bit in common, that both began their careers in animal research, moved into the human laboratory doing behavioral pharmacology work during their postdoctoral fellowship, had very successful careers in behavioral pharmacology research in the area of medication development, leading to an expansion into clinical trial research, and both spent productive years on the faculty at Johns Hopkins, overlapping actually for 2 years. In addition, both have superior records as superior mentors, and I can claim for sure that that is true, as Sharon's been a primary mentor for me for many years, and have had significant accomplishments in translating science into policy and regulation, and important leadership responsibilities at CPDD. So Sharon's been in charge of the scientific program committee, she's been on the board, she's been a past president as well, and I can tell you just, she doesn't mind getting her feet dirty and going on road trips. We've gone on road trips to interesting places in Appalachia and then gone into interesting places in Southeast Florida, and all with the goal of making sure that the science that she has done, as well as all of her colleagues here in the College of Problem of Drug Dependence, gets really translated into actual clinical practice. So Marion and Sharon have both accomplished this while raising a family, an amazing family. So we've got 3 beautiful children, great husband, and many animals too. So I can't forget the animals. And so she's just been an amazing role model for aspiring women scientists. And so when I hear about Marion Ficshman, it's always very clear that she's been beloved, and I think the same is true for Sharon. And come on up, Sharon.
Oh, well, thank you, Michelle. And I can't tell you how honored I am. So the title of my talk today is Opioid Euphoria and Dysphoria, A Tale of Two Cities. And I want to start just with a little bit of gratitude, and then I want to follow with some thoughts remembering Marion. And then I'm going to go on to the science. I'm going to talk about some old science. I'm going to talk about some new science. And as Walter reminded us yesterday, I'm going to talk about all the really important people along the way. And at the end, I'm going to return to Marion. So I first met Marion when I went to Johns Hopkins as a brand new postdoctoral fellow. Marion was a full professor there. She was an iconic figure. She was an amazing scientist. Her laboratory was on a different campus, and so while we were at the same place, I didn't really get to spend a lot of time with her when we were at Hopkins, but I did get to know her. It was only 2 short years after that she moved on to form a new substance abuse treatment research unit at Columbia with Herb Kleber. And I have to say that the excellence of the research that they do at Columbia, my colleagues Richard Fulton, Suzette Evans, Sandy Comer, Meg Haney, and others, carry on the legacy of Marion. So when I started at Hopkins, I was working with Kenzie Preston, and Kenzie had initiated a series of studies, very, very strong and important studies in the area of cocaine abuse. And Marion, of course, was the cocaine person. She had done so much important work in that area. And so I read all of her studies. And I just longed to run into her in the hall so I could just ask her about her latest results. And we actually even published a study together, and here it is. This study was a joint project between the two sites, and Suzette Evans was the lead author. And this was just one more drug in a long line of dopaminergic agents that unfortunately were shown to be ineffective against cocaine. So for the science portion of my talk today, I could have talked about the cocaine research that I did. For many years, I spent about half of my time doing work in the cocaine area and half in the opiate area. But if I had chosen that topic, then we probably would be finished in about 10 minutes, because I would say, and then we tested this drug, and that one didn't work, and then we went on to this drug, and that one didn't work. So unfortunately, we're still searching. So of all the work that Marion did, I think that this study that she published with Dorothy Hatsukami in 1996 is probably my favorite, and also I think the most important. At the time that Dorothy and Marion began working on this study, the crack cocaine epidemic was raging in the inner cities and disproportionately affecting African Americans. And this was following an earlier epidemic of powdered cocaine use that was common mostly amongst white, middle, and upper class people. However, the Federal Sentencing Commission made a decision that crack was somehow far more dangerous, and that 5 milligrams or 5 grams of possession of crack cocaine would land you with a 5-year sentence in jail. At the same time, if you were in possession of powdered cocaine, it would require 500, 100-fold more of the same drug in order to get the same sentence. This policy was resulting in unfairly high incarceration rates of people who were largely poor and often minorities. And Dorothy and Marion saw the unfairness about this, and they decided to use our best weapon, which is our science, and try to tackle this issue. And so they published this paper, and what they did was they reviewed all of the extant literature on cocaine, and they did it in the most scientific way possible. And what they concluded essentially was that cocaine was cocaine, whether it was a base or a salt, and that these sentencing decisions were absurd, and they were not grounded in science. So I think that using science to educate and inform policy and to protect those who are stigmatized and unable to speak for themselves is probably the most important privilege and maybe a mandate that we have in this field. And so I think that with this paper, Marion and Dorothy set the bar high for us as an example, and that we should all try to live up to that example. And so with that, I'm going to move on to the first of the cities in my tale of two cities, and that is Baltimore, Maryland. So in 1990, I landed at the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit, which was like an incredible science machine. I could not have been more fortunate. And I was incredibly lucky because not only did I have one remarkable mentor, but I had 3. So I worked very closely with Kenzie Preston and Maxine Stitzer and George Bigelow. And I came in as a group of postdoctoral fellows, as you can see, only girl, first boys club, okay? This was our entering postdoctoral class. And you might notice a few familiar faces who are still making a real impact in the field here. There's Mark Greenwald, Mike Kidorf, Kenny Boy Silverman, that's what we called him, Jeffrey K. Mumford, and others. And so we all landed at the same time, roughly, and we were really ready to go. So at the time, this was the early buprenorphine development days. And as I said, I decided not to talk about cocaine medications because we didn't have any experience with any that worked, so I chose this medication because this is one that does work. At the time, we knew that buprenorphine, as everybody knows now, was a partial mu-opioid agonist and a kappa antagonist. We know now that it has nociceptin properties. I'm not even sure that we knew what that was at the time. But given the animal data, what we thought was buprenorphine should have a better profile as a partial agonist for safety, that there should be some limit on the respiratory depression. But we didn't actually have the data. We also knew as a partial agonist it was going to be harder to put it into people that were already dependent on something because it had the potential to precipitate withdrawal. And that would not really be a good entrance into treatment, right? So we had to figure out what were the conditions under which we could give this drug to people who were already dependent, either on drugs from the street or perhaps they were, on methadone or something else. And how could we avoid that? How could we make this transition smooth? So now we already know all these answers, right, because they're in the package insert, but at the time we didn't know any of them. And so we sought to use the human laboratory as a model to try and investigate this. And so these are data from the very first study that I did. This is actually, there are two studies. We did one in ascending order. We did the next one in randomized order for good scientific purposes, but we were really looking at the respiratory depressant effects of buprenorphine in individuals who were opioid users, but they were not physically dependent, so they weren't completely tolerant. The doses of buprenorphine that we tested here were 70 times higher than the analgesic doses. These doses had never been given to humans before. And the one thing that I learned early on, making this transition to human research, was that it couldn't really be readily reversed with naloxone because of its high affinity. So that was a little scary because we thought, okay, we're going to do this, and then what happens? And so, we had to explore all other kinds of pharmacological approaches to reversing opioid withdrawal besides the opioid receptor system. So this early study demonstrated to us that we could really give a broad range of doses to individuals. And one of the things that was interesting that we observed was at the higher doses on subjective ratings, while people didn't really report substantially higher ratings of feeling high as the dose increased, it did last longer. And those observations led the way for some of those studies that looked at alternate day dosing and trying to figure out how long you could use buprenorphine if you doubled the dose or tripled the dose. This next early study was one that we did really trying to begin to get at this idea that what do we do when we want to transition somebody? And so in this study, we maintained people on 30 milligrams of methadone and 60 milligrams of methadone. And then 40 hours after their last dose, we substituted one of the doses shown along the x-axis. And so those doses were either oral doses of methadone or buprenorphine given sublingually. And what we found in this study, and what we're looking at here are just ratings of bad effects, but if I showed you withdrawal signs and symptoms, they would map onto this, was that as the buprenorphine dose went higher, we saw a greater likelihood of bad effects, and that as the physical dependence level increased from 30 to 60 milligrams of methadone, we saw that increase as well. And so this made us think, well, maybe we need to only transition people who are on lower doses, and maybe if they're really on high doses, we won't be able to transition them, or we'll have to figure out how to taper them down. This was just buprenorphine by itself as a partial agonist, but as the development was going along, there was real keen interest in using buprenorphine in combination with naloxone as an initial abuse deterrent formulation, with the idea that if you gave buprenorphine naloxone as intended by the sublingual route, it wouldn't precipitate withdrawal because the naloxone would not have any bioavailability. But if the person were to divert it to a parenteral route, the naloxone would become available and precipitate withdrawal. And so this study that was led by Ken Stoller was really showed kind of that proof of concept. So in looking at the doses of buprenorphine for sublingual in that first dose response curve, you can see when we're asking about bad effects, there's really no evidence of those at all, and no evidence that naloxone is active. But then when given parenterally, those same doses produce dose-dependent precipitated withdrawal. The final study that I want to talk about from the laboratory was getting back to this issue of, so there may be people who have very high levels of physical dependence, and how do we get them onto buprenorphine? And this was a study that was led by Eric Strain that we did, and I still like this study a lot, because one of the things that we had observed in different studies was that individuals, even if you put everybody on the same maintenance dose, when you look at withdrawal, there's a lot of individual variation that we don't really understand. And so what we did in this study was we maintained people on 100 milligrams of methadone a day. This is a very high dose, and we assumed that you wouldn't be able to transition them very readily onto buprenorphine. And so in this case, what we did was we started giving buprenorphine doses in an ascending series, and we did that until people had precipitated withdrawal, and there were specific criteria. Once that dose was identified for that individual, they went into a second phase of the study. And in the second phase of the study, that dose, regardless of what it was given again to replicate the effect. And then it was tested again 2 hours apart, divided into half, with the idea that if you perhaps hit them with just a little bit less buprenorphine, let a little time pass, and then give a little bit more, maybe we can eliminate this precipitated withdrawal. And so these were the outcomes. We had 10 subjects who completed, and remarkably, 3 of the 10 subjects made it all the way up to 32 milligrams with 8 milligrams of naloxone without experiencing any opioid withdrawal. And so this really kind of speaks to the issue of the individual variability. 7 of the people experienced withdrawal, 4 at the lowest dose, 4-1, 2 at the 8 milligram dose, and 1 at the 16 milligram dose. And so then this is what we found. When we looked at just responses on a visual analog scale of how much does the drug have any good effects, you can see that the drugs all really pretty much look the same, although there's a little bit more of a signal for methadone, that people like methadone a little bit more in this preparation. But then when we asked them whether or not it made them feel sick, you can see that the full dose that we had identified for that individual did precipitate withdrawal and make them feel sick, very similar to naloxone alone. But when you split that dose, which is the function that's right next to the first bar, we almost completely eliminated it. And so this kind of small incremental dosing is the strategy that we now use in clinical practice. And I don't want to characterize these as being like the only studies that were done, or that Hopkins was the only place that was doing them. There was tremendous interest, and this was a huge, huge community of investigators that were all trying to kind of get at these same questions so that when the drug came onto the market, it would be ready for use by physicians. At the same time, one of my other colleagues, Ed Johnson, who in my very early days I only thought was a pharmacist because he was named Ed, and then I was reading all these really great papers, and it was Raleigh, and I think one day I was talking to him, and he was talking to me about one of those papers, and I was like, "Do you know that guy?" And he's like, "I am that guy." But Ed, as a pharmacist and also as an investigator who was committed really to getting buprenorphine onto the market, and this was long before he ever thought about working for Reckitt, he also was willing to do these crazy studies where you would enroll a couple hundred people and they'd each be taking 4 preparations. They'd be like double, triple dummy studies because he was doing all the preps. I mean, if it had been anybody else, the pharmacist would have been kind of consecutively quitting because of the workload, but Ed was, he was willing to do this. And so these are some data from a study that Ed led looking at a clinical trial in which buprenorphine was compared head-to-head with methadone, which of course was the gold standard, looking at a high dose and a low dose. And it used a flexible dosing procedure, so it made it even more complicated. And you can see that buprenorphine here appears to be equivalent to high-dose methadone. And when we look at self-reported opioid use, we see that there's an even more dramatic drop for all the groups. Okay, so those were some really heady days. We were a very close team. Money was flowing out of the NIH faucet. I mean, it's not like that anymore, but we could not do studies fast enough, and I spent about a decade working with this crew, Kenny Boy Silverman, and Eric Strain and Ed Johnson, and I'm forever indebted to them. So about 2005, I'm moving to the second city. We made the decision to move south. And we went to Lexington, Kentucky. And for those of you who don't remember your history, Lexington, Kentucky is actually the site of the U.S. narcotics prison farm where so much of the seminal work in our field was done in the 30s and 40s before we stopped doing work with prisoners. But this is actually a still functioning prison. And I think that I was in Lexington maybe about 2 months before we got our small children signed up for soccer, which all good parents do. And we were sitting in this very beautiful park, and I'm looking over and I see kind of off the side of the hill this big kind of frightening looking building. And it was, in fact, the narcotics farm right at Masterson Station. And it is still functioning, like I said, as a prison. So 2 things were happening at the time that I was making the transition to Kentucky. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. The first was this, which everybody has seen this slide probably 100 times. The prescription opioid epidemic had taken hold, and Kentucky was right in the heart of it. And so this slide just shows the increasing rates of sales in green, of opioid prescriptions, the co-occurring increase in deaths related to overdose, and then the treatment admissions for prescription opioid misuse or abuse. The second thing that was happening in the background was that buprenorphine had been launched. So this slide just shows the numbers of physicians who are getting certified to practice with buprenorphine in the United States from the period of 2002, when the drug was approved, to 2012. And you can see that there was very significant uptake. So I'm going to tackle each of these topics just a little bit separately. Okay, so in Kentucky, this is actually what the prescription epidemic, opioid epidemic, looked like. So these are actual advertisements from a newspaper, free, in Broward, Palm Beach, New Times, that Michelle and I collected on one of our trips. And there were hundreds of these, okay? And these are advertisements for medical practices, okay? So if you look at the picture, they have, stripper-like females. They're offering discounts, coupons, % off, on-site dosing. They'll provide transportation. And they have new docs, so you should come in and meet them. By 2009, 34 states had prescription drug monitoring programs, and Florida was not one of them. The governor, who I will not name, was very adamant that they did not need one. Between August 2008 and November 2009, a new pain clinic opened on average every 3 days in these 2 counties alone. And there was an increase from 4 pain clinics in 2007 to 291 pain clinics in these 2 counties by 2009. So why is Florida relevant to Kentucky? Well, it's relevant because there was a tremendous bus service that had been developed around this, whereby people could get on the bus in the morning, go to Florida with their sponsor and their fake x-rays and so forth and so on, land, get their huge bottles of Xanax, oxycodone, hydrocodone, get back on the bus, and be back in Kentucky by nightfall. So we had this huge surge of drugs hitting our streets. So how do you tackle a problem like this? Well, one of the things that we decided to do was to use our laboratory studies and to see what kind of information we could have to inform what was happening. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple of these. The first was a series of studies that we did to examine hydrocodone. So hydrocodone is a really old opioid, 70, 80 years old. It's a full mu opioid agonist. The hydrocodone products represented the #1 selling drug in the United States above every other single drug class. And we consume something like 99% of the world's hydrocodone in the US, even though we have a relatively small portion of the population of the world. Hydrocodone was placed in Schedule III in the 1970s, and at that time it was suggested that hydrocodone was 30-fold less potent than morphine. And so Schedule III designation applied to any combination products, and there were literally hundreds and hundreds, there still are, and any mono products that had less than 15 milligrams of hydrocodone. When I went back to the really old data, which took me back to the Lexington prison farm data, I looked at it and I thought, this is a full mu agonist. Like, why? Like, how did this happen? What's the history? Is it really any different? The DEA had petitioned the FDA, those 2 agencies actually don't get along that well, just in case you didn't know that, to upschedule hydrocodone products to Schedule II, and the argument kind of fell flat and it never went anywhere. But the DEA is persistent, if nothing else. So about 10 years later, they came back and they said, we still want to do this. And at that time, we had done this series of studies, and there were some of the, they were very simple studies, but they were some of the only contemporary data on hydrocodone. And so here are some results for one of them. And this is just showing you the time course, looking at oxycodone, hydrocodone in the middle, and hydromorphone. And here we're just looking at a visual analog scale, asking how high you are. We did some pilot testing. We wanted to find equipotent doses so we could compare them kind of head to head, so the doses are slightly different. And then we did another study that was led by Bill Stoops that looked at morphine, oxycodone, and hydrocodone. In this case, we gave them intravenously because obviously that was the way that they were being used. In both cases, we found that hydrocodone was virtually indistinguishable from the other opioids. It looked just like those. In the IV case, the relative potency looks like it's a little bit less because here we were actually testing identical doses. But overall, we concluded that hydrocodone was no different than anything else that was in Schedule II, and the relative potency, at least by the oral route, was about 1-to-1, as opposed to what had been thought before. And ultimately, these data helped contribute to the change in policy and the upscheduling, which is no small feat, of hydrocodone into Schedule II. And I have colleagues who say that they don't think the schedule of control actually means anything. But I'll tell you that I don't think that that's really true, because since it's been rescheduled, prescriptions for hydrocodone products have declined about 30%. We're talking about hundreds of millions of prescriptions that were being prescribed before. So scheduling does tell doctors something. It makes them have some sense of safety if it's in a lower schedule. Another drug that we were interested in was tramadol. Tramadol is unusual, and most people probably know about it. The parent drug actually inhibits the uptake of serotonin and norepinephrine and has limited affinity for the mu-opioid receptor, but its primary metabolite is a mu-opioid agonist. And when tramadol was introduced in the United States in 1995, it was actually introduced as completely unscheduled, which was also a bit of a mystery to me, especially when we started seeing signals of the people that were coming into our center telling us that they were using tramadol. And at that time, there were really good data coming out from like Rick Dart's group as well that were detecting these signals. So we took this back to the laboratory. We did a comparison between tramadol and oxycodone, and we also looked at codeine kind of as a low efficacy comparator. This work was led by Shana Babylonis, and I'm not showing you the dynamic outcome here because I'm showing you the drug self-administration progressive ratio, because this is a really great behavioral paradigm that we've taken from the animal laboratory and translated into humans. And what you can see here is that oxycodone, as expected, produced dose-dependent increases in self-administration. Nobody takes placebo. They recognize it. They don't want to do that. Because they can get money as the alternative choice. And then tramadol also was self-administered in a dose-dependent fashion, with the highest dose of tramadol actually showing the greatest self-administration, or the highest breaking point. So subsequent to that, tramadol was also placed into Schedule 4. So I'm going to move back now to talk about what was happening with the buprenorphine landscape, because all these physicians were starting to get licensed and they were starting to use it. But once it was marketed, signals of buprenorphine abuse and misuse emerged, and then the emergence of pill mill providers, because the whole pill mill model had been clearly, created already, so you could just take that and use it as a buprenorphine clinic. You can see here in the picture, there are like signs as though they're selling mattresses, but they're actually selling Suboxone all over the rural areas in western Virginia and eastern Kentucky. So we know that surveillance studies suggested that a very common reason for buprenorphine misuse was a lack of access to treatment. But we also recognize that there were some provider issues related to knowledge and experience, because addiction medicine was really a very new field. So people were getting their license. It only took 8 hours of training to do it. And then suddenly they were prepared to launch, except that they maybe had never worked with anybody who had a drug use disorder, and maybe they were coming from another field. They were a surgeon, or they were an anesthesiologist, or, the providers really represent the whole range of medical specialties. So along with my dear friend, Michelle, we ended up launching this study with the idea that we were tasked with trying to reduce diversion. That's what we were tasked with. And it's like, well, how do you go about doing that scientifically? Because that's actually the police job, right? But Michelle thought that if we could use non-traditional CME activities to improve knowledge and promote quality practice behaviors, that we could help physicians decrease misuse and diversion in their practices. And we even titled it something that would be kind of catchy for them. It was like protecting your practice, learn about this. And so we spent time gathering data and guidelines to develop a curriculum to teach time and cost-efficient, concrete ways to structure treatment. And these are all the reasons why a physician unknowingly may actually be contributing to misuse and diversion. They could have patients coming into their practice that they're not screening appropriately. Maybe they're not even opioid users. They could be under-prescribing, and they can be over-prescribing so that somebody can take half their dose and then they can sell the other half to support their treatment costs. Just looking at the time here. They can give the medication in an unsupervised setting, or when supervision of ingestion is incomplete, or they could be failing to address the disorder beyond medication. So we went about the country talking to a lot of doctors, and here are some actual confessions from some of the ex-licensed doctors. So The ones who really have poor intentions and really want to just set up a pill mill, we didn't expect that they would come and listen to us. But what we were surprised by was that there are doctors who really had good intentions, but just really didn't understand enough. So people were pretty honest about their practice. People were prescribing Temgesic, which is a parenteral Schedule II buprenorphine product for analgesia that's not allowed in office-based practice for the treatment of opioid use disorder, because their patients preferred injecting their medication. They were prescribing methadone in office-based practice, which is a clear violation of the federal law. They were automatically prescribing very high doses, for example, 32 milligrams on the very first day of treatment. And they really didn't understand a lot about buprenorphine. It's not that complex of a drug, but for people that haven't taken pharmacology in maybe 30 years, it's, a little tricky. So people believed that naloxone in the combination product was actually going to be helpful in addressing alcohol use disorder. And they thought that you should dose it like 4 times a day, just like you would any other analgesic. So we actually turned this into a study, and we invited a sample of people from Appalachia and from Wisconsin, 2 areas that were particularly hard hit and showing very high signals for buprenorphine misuse. We got IRB approval. We did 4 surveys to evaluate outcomes that were before the CME, on site after the CME, and 1 to 3 months later to see whether or not physicians were able to retain the information. So this is just a breakdown of the specialty training of the CME attendees. And you can see that in Appalachia, they had fewer months of experience. So these are really novices. And then in Wisconsin, they had a little bit more experience, but still not very much because it was a brand new area. And so when asked kind of what's very straight, seems like a straightforward question to us, if buprenorphine was reclassified to Schedule II, it would not be legal to prescribe it in an office-based setting for opioid use disorder. Right? So the answer to that is yes, that's absolutely true, because it can only be something that's Schedule III. And what we found was that very few people actually knew the answer to that, and that number was improved dramatically on site. It appears that some people forgot later on. When asked about withdrawal and induction, this is like one of the first instructions in the package insert. You make sure that somebody's in withdrawal so that they do not have precipitated withdrawal. What percentage of your patients are in opioid withdrawal at the time of initiating treatment? It should have been 100%, but you can see that at the yellow baseline in the 81 to 100% category, it's really only about 50% of the people. So there were many other things that we did in this study, but it was very eye-opening for us. And this also was it was a lot of fun, and it was a great opportunity to think about what we're doing in the laboratory. We're not doing science for science sake. We're doing science to improve the lives of other people. And if that means taking it to the physicians who are going to treat those people or taking it to patients, then we need to figure out how to translate these things and make people really understand them. And so I ended up having a wonderful opportunity during this period and subsequently to do a lot of training with physicians who were just learning how to use buprenorphine abroad. And I did that with this group of yahoos. And this is the Real Boys Club. This is Chris Chaplio, Robert Eli, and Walter Ling, of course, our Nathan B. Award winner. And I'm not really sure who the women are in that picture. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what we're doing right now. So most recently, we've been working with new formulations of buprenorphine that we think have the potential to transform the field. Because we know that a lot of the problems with buprenorphine and buprenorphine expansion have to do with concerns about diversion and misuse, if you could use a sustained release formulation that goes into the patient and can't come out of the patient and can't be shared or can't create an overdose situation, we think that that really holds a great deal of promise. So with probufene, we are involved in the large-scale trial of the probufene implant. This is a combination of a polymer and buprenorphine blended into these little matchstick size rods that are shown there. 4 rods produce sustained release of buprenorphine for up to 6 months of coverage, and it's intended for patients who are already stable on 8 milligrams of sublingual daily. These are the results from the pivotal study that led to its approval. And this study enrolled individuals who were already stabilized and in treatment on buprenorphine. And 177 people were randomized, 166 completed the 6-month study. There was 94% retention in this study. okay? I want you to just think about that. Like, what did you start that was going to last for 6 months and 94% of the people are still doing it, right? So these are really high rates for substance abuse trials. And so for anyone who says to me, I don't believe in medication, usually my first response is, well, actually, it's not a religion. This is actually about evidence. These results alone, I think, are so remarkable. Looking at the primary analysis with the requirement for 4 of 6 months without any illicit opioid use, you can see in the two groups, the implant and the sublingual group, that 96 and 88% of the individuals were able to achieve that. And looking at the requirement for a full 6 months of total abstinence, as defined by the protocol, 86 and 72% of the people had no drug use in those 6 months. The next technology that we've been investigating is called CAM 2038, and you may have heard a talk next door just before mine. And this is a subcutaneous formulation of buprenorphine. It uses a fluid crystal nanotechnology. It is injected just under the skin in a very small volume, and there it forms a gel. And this is being developed by Camurus and Braeburn Pharmaceuticals as a partnership. And they have 2 formulations, a 1-week formulation and a 4-week coverage formulation. And dosing can be titrated. It has very, very high bioavailability. So just for like 1 week of something equivalent to 16 milligrams daily, the total amount of buprenorphine in the product is 24 milligrams. And it's contained in less than 0.5 mils. So it's a very small injection volume. So hopefully, readily tolerated. It comes ready to use and has no preparation. These are data from a study that I'll be presenting in full later this week. But this was a blockade study where we're looking at the ability of CAM treatment to suppress the response to hydromorphone. And you can see that in the first set of, everybody's got different screens, I guess. The first set of conditions here, this is looking at the response to hydromorphone at 0, 6, and 18 milligrams given intramuscularly to individuals who are have moderate to severe opiate use disorder who are not seeking treatment and are physically dependent. And you can see that when they're asked about the liking for their hydromorphone, they like it quite a bit. And it is nice and dose-related, and after that point, then individuals were randomized to receive either 24 or 32 milligrams of CAM, and they were re-challenged with the hydromorphone and placebo doses, and you can see that there's nearly complete suppression immediately after injection that persists for the weekly interval. A second injection was given in between, and again, we see complete reduction. And in this case, the FDA defined the criteria that would be considered complete blockade, and it was achieved for this study. And then these are the CAL scores. So immediately after the very first injection, we see complete and sustained suppression of opioid withdrawal. Okay, so with that, I just want to start to wrap up by talking about where we are right now. So I've talked a little bit about buprenorphine and methadone. We also have naltrexone. We're very fortunate because we don't have medications for some of the other drug use disorders. Sam Quinones received the Media Award yesterday, talked about his book, Dreamland. This is a great book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to. But basically, the message is heroin comes to a town near you. And so when I came to Kentucky, no one ever had used heroin. If I talked to somebody who did, they were from someplace else. Now everybody that comes through our door is using heroin, and it's because of this. And this is reflected in this slide as well, where we're looking at number of overdose deaths per 100,000. And you can see that the prescription opioid overdose deaths are going up, but you can see an even more precipitous decline in overdose deaths related to heroin. So wouldn't we be lucky if it was just prescription opioids and heroin? But it's not, because now we have fentanyl coming in from China. And this slide is DEA, National Forensic Laboratory Information data. And what it's describing is the number of exhibits testing positive for fentanyl and showing that this number increased just between 2014 and 2015 by 65%. So we have heroin, we have fentanyl, we also have carfentanil, we have acrylfentanyl, we have U47700, they're digging out the old synthesis books. This is an old Upjohn compound. We have gray death, and who knows what we'll have next week. And we also have counterfeit pills that are killing people. that look just like the pharmaceutical product, but they're not. So we're faced with this enormous crisis, and we have effective treatments, but this is the reality. So this is a sign that was posted outside of the Kenton County Courthouse. Kenton County is the northernmost Kentucky county, and it's right on the outskirts of Cincinnati. This is an area that's really been hard hit. And the sign reads, Suboxone users, if you want probation or diversion and you're on Suboxone, you must be weaned off by the time of your sentencing date. So this little star is my marker of major and minor ignorance here. Okay, so you'll notice the star on the next slide as well. We have Dr. Tom Price, our Secretary for Health and Human Services, who just last month was asked about drug treatment options, and he touted faith-based programs while showing less support for medication-assisted programs. And he said, if we're just substituting one opioid for another, we're not moving the dial much, he said. Folks need to be cured so they can be productive members of society and realize their dreams. And I suspect that Marie Neiswander and Vince Dole probably heard this same thing like 45 or 50 years ago. And somehow or another, we had an election, and now we're back in time. I'm not sure what happened exactly. But here's Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, who just called for the harshest sentencing penalties for small possession rather than treatment. And so that really harkens back to Marion's early work that I was showing. Okay, so every single day, you can look in the newspaper, or you can turn on the radio, or you can turn on the television, and you cannot miss out on hearing about what's happening with the opioid overdose epidemic. And despite that, we have judges who are practicing medicine. They think that they know better than doctors, so they're prohibiting effective treatments from people that are in their drug courts. We have insurance companies who are blocking patients from receiving treatment. They're telling physicians, you need to taper people off regularly. Well, we know that tapering actually kills people, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. The insurance companies will tell people what dose they should be using. They will tell them how long someone can be in treatment. Then we have family court judges who have parents who get into treatment, get stabilized, become abstinent, regain control of their lives, and then they're told that they need to come off of their medication if they ever want to get their children back. At the same time, we are facing the rollback of the ACA, and the ACA really expanded access to treatment. No matter what anybody says about it, it really made things better for our field. And the fact that we may be slipping back means that we're going to have even less access. So with that, I just want to remember Marion and how she wanted to use science to improve policy. And I think that we all need to use our science to improve access to treatment and to reduce stigma. Despite 40 years of evidence that detoxification often leads to death, it's still the most common treatment. And methadone and buprenorphine are really effective, and there's a huge unmet treatment need and too many barriers in the United States. We estimate that we have about 1 in 10 of the needed treatment slots, but I guarantee you it's far less than that. We know that substance abuse is a chronic relapsing disorder, and that sustained treatment produces sustained results. And I am pretty sure that it's highly unlikely that we're either going to pray or arrest ourselves out of this public health crisis. And so I would encourage all of you to make certain that you talk to your policymakers, you talk to your state government, you talk to your insurers, you join the advocacy organization here at CPDD, and you try your best to take the science that we all know about in this room and make the public more aware of it so that we can save more lives. And so with that, I want to just say a few words of thanks. I really want to thank the people who nominated me for this award. I want to thank Michelle Lawful, who led the charge. She was and has been a colleague of mine for a very long time, a very dear friend, and she's someone that I learn from every day. George Bigelow, who wrote a letter as well, who is really the best mentor anybody could ever ask for. I'm the luckiest girl in the world. And then also Bob Balster, who is a very dear friend and longstanding colleague. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Loretta Finnegan, because she tried to get me nominated for this a number of years ago. And before she took over as being in charge of CPDD and became hopelessly in conflict, she was very, very supportive of that. I also want to thank the awards committee, because I know that they get many nominations for all of the awards, and I'm certain that the deliberations are very challenging every year. And finally, I want to thank the college itself, which has provided me with a scientific home for the last 25 years under the leadership of Marty Adler and now under Loretta's leadership. There are too many individual people for me to thank along the way because I would leave somebody out, and I covered a broad range of work. But postdoctoral fellows, students, research assistants, nurses, colleagues, NIDA project officers, and certainly NIDA for funding. I also want to give a special thanks to Paul Nuzzo. No, he's not a model. This is not a model picture. I've known Paul for 20 years. I hired Paul as a research assistant. It was his first job out of college. And we've worked together ever since. Amazingly, because the first study that he was assigned to was to administer full kappa agonist to humans, and it wasn't a pretty sight. But he stuck with me, and he serves as our statistician. We work together at Hopkins and now at UK, manager, trainer, and he's just an extraordinary collaborator. And with that, I want to thank the very best club of all, which is my family, and my husband, Patrick. And in the upper picture, you can see that the children once were little, and it's hard to believe now because they are all so big. And with that, I thank you for your attention.